Okay, so for today, we'll be talking about Module 3, or the overview of the environmental management in the Philippines. So let's start with the environmental governance and management mechanisms. To define environmental governance, it refers to the means by which society determines and acts on goals and priorities related to the management of environment and natural resources. So in here, there are policies involved in implementing the environmental management in the Philippines. In the Philippines, these are the laws that started the the environmental governance. So it is as early as 1866 that we have laws, Spanish law on water. It was followed by during the American colonial rule, which with all the following acts, followed by during the Commonwealth period, uh, after the Second World War. Then we also have the post-war period for the following Republic Acts. Then most of the legislative enactments were during the martial law. In particular, we have the Presidential Decree 1151 and 1152, which actually set the bar or started the environmental management in the country. Now, the environmental governance in the Philippines is multi-sectoral and multi-level. So, with this kind of nature of agenda setting, it integrates the interests of the people. It integrates the interests of the common good of everyone. So, meaning everyone is involved in environmental governance. For the multi-sectoral governance, there are actually a lot of key players working together for the environmental management. So the following are involved. We have the government, the private sectors, and the environmental non-government organizations. So the private sector and the environmental non-government organizations, they actually provide support. But most of the activities, particularly in the regulation of the environmental management, private sectors contribute more. However, the government actually plays the most significant role in environmental governance. So the involvement of the government is anchored on its interests to ensure that there is a proper implementation of public sector interests in environmental policy because its legitimacy and political sustainability resonates on its ability to put credence to its policy intentions, which include the delivery of environmental management services to the general population. It is actually the responsibility of the government to implement the environmental policies, to enforce them, and actually to provide penal provisions for those who violate these environmental policies. So within the government, there is a key implementing agency responsible for each environmental management related legislations. So they are tasked to implement functions that are deemed necessary in environmental management. So these are the implementing agencies in the country. So we have the Environmental Management Bureau that is responsible for the environmental quality parameters and corresponding stressors. We have the Biodiversity Management Bureau for the biodiversity management and conservation. We have also the Mines and Geosciences Bureau, particularly on the management of the mineral resources. We have the Forest Management Bureau that is focused on forestry resources. All of these are from the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, or DNR. Also from the DNR, we have the Land Management Bureau. So they are responsible for the survey, classification, lease, sale, or any other forms of concessions or disposition of public lands. We have the Ecosystems Research and Development Bureau that is focused on doing researches in various ecosystems such as forests, upland farms, grasslands, degraded areas, coastal zones, freshwater in urban areas. Now, the Department of Agriculture is responsible for the management of use of agricultural resources. The National Water Resources Board, they are responsible for the use of water, management of the use of water. You also have under the Department of Agriculture the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources that is responsible for the management of the use of fishery and other aquatic resources. Now, the Philippine Coast Guard is responsible for the marine environment, the Department of Energy for the management of the use of energy resources. We also have the Climate Change Commission that is focused on establishing climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies in the country. Then the National Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Council that is responsible for the management of disaster risk or as well as reducing this risk over time. Now, the local government unit or the LGUs, they are responsible for the overall management at the local level, particularly in the management of our environment. The Department of Social Welfare and Development and Department of Health or PSWD and DOH, they're focused on the people's health and welfare management. The National Commission for Indigenous People, of course, is the commission responsible for the indigenous people or indigenous cultural communities welfare management. The National Commission for Culture and the Arts, the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, and the National Museum for the protection, preservation, and conservation of the cultural heritage. So these are actually the key implementing agencies of the environmental management in the country. So as you can see, there are actually a lot of agencies responsible and they should be working together for our environment. Now, in terms of the multi-level environmental governance, it appears that our government uh, follows a multi-level scheme. So we have the local governance, the regional governance, the national governance, and the international governance. So basically, at the local level, the local governance, LGUs, or the local government units are responsible for the management. However, planning are actually implemented at the regional level or the regional governance. Now, at the national governance, these were actually the agenda setting is being formed. Now, our national governance or national policies, they should also be anchored to the international governance or international commitments. Because when we talk about environment, this is not just only focused on the country itself, but on the interrelationship of the different countries. Because there is actually a transboundary movement of certain pollutants. It means many countries are actually involved when we speak of environment. So at the international level, there are actually multilateral environmental agreements. These are actually the most prominent features that regulate the process of environmental management at the international level. So MEA or multilateral environmental agreements, these are type of international agreement which is legally binding and through which national governments commit to achieving specific environmental goals. So these agreements may take into different forms. This may be as a convention, a treaty, an agreement, a charter, a final act, a pact, accord, a covenant, protocol, or constitutions, in which actually the Philippines signed on or ratify these multilateral environmental agreements. So in the multi-environmental agreements, parties involved are actually the states. So or these are the countries. Now, in the Philippines, we follow certain environmental governance strategies. So these are three. So we have the decentralization, the devolution, and co-management. These are actually mentioned in Module 2. So decentralization, it involves the lowering of the loci of decision making among national government agencies to their offices and regions, provinces, and municipalities or cities. It means they leave the decision making to certain level. So they decentralize the decision making. For the devolution, it involves the transfer of some functions of national government agencies to local governments. In this way, it widened the participation of the local governments and environmental governance nationwide because there is now more participation at the local level. Next, we have the co-management. It refers to government and local communities undertaking joint action to address an environmental problem, usually concerning the development and use of resources. Governance and agenda setting is jointly done by government agencies and the residents of a local community. So it means in here, you now involve your stakeholders in environmental governance. Let's now talk about the environmental laws and international commitments in the country, or in the international commitments in which the country is involved. So laws actually provide the framework for environmental management in the country. So laws on specific aspects of the environment were enacted to operationalize environmental management provisions of the Constitution as well as the basic environmental policies. So without these laws, we will not be guided on what to do in a certain resource or certain environment or certain ecosystem. So they are actually very essential. We need these environmental management laws so there will be a proper regulation, a proper organization of our resources. In the country, we have two important environmental policies. These are actually the PD 1157 or the Philippine Environmental Policy and the PD 1152 or the Philippine Environment Code. So these are two essential environmental policies in which it sets all the environmental policies succeeding. So PD 1151, it recognized the conflicting demands of population growth, urbanization, industrial expansion, rapid natural resources utilization, increasing technological advances have resulted in a piecemeal approach concept for environmental protection. This PD 1151, it recognizes the need for an integrated approach of environmental management. Meanwhile, PD 1152 or the Philippine Environment Code, it recognized the broad spectrum of environment as a matter of vital concern to the government. The code is intended to be a comprehensive program of environmental protection and management. So this time, it talks about that environment is not just actually the natural resources, but everything that surrounds us, involving the people, including actually the people as well as the cultural heritage. The environmental laws in the Philippines are categorized based on the major environmental management intent. So they are categorized according to one, environmental quality management. Two, management of the use of natural resources. Three, biodiversity and ecosystems management. Four, climate change and disaster management. And lastly, the socio-cultural resources management. Now, for the environmental quality management, to start off with, we have the environmental quality management standards and status monitoring. So these are the Republic Acts or presidential decree for each to monitor or to set the standard or to monitor the quality of the environment. So we have for the air quality, we have RA 9749, that is the Philippine Clean Air Act. We have what for the water quality, we have the RA 9275, the Philippine Clean Water Act, PD 979, the Marine Pollution Decree, RA 993, the Philippine Coast Guard Law. For the land quality, we have the PD 933. It recognizes the need to regulate the land use vis-a-vis management of the quality of life. The RA 7279 or the Urban Development and Housing Act of 1992. For the management of environmental quality stressors, the following are the laws. So without impacts of undertakings, the PD 1586, or this is it established the Philippine Environmental Impact System, Statement System. We have the Solid Waste or RA 9003, the Ecological Solid Waste Management Act. We have the Toxic Chemicals and Hazardous Waste, RA 6969, the Toxic Chemicals and Hazardous Waste Management Act. We have PD 856, the Code of Sanitation requirement to install treatment facilities. Now, for the adjudication of pollution cases, we have RA 3931, PD 984, and Executive Order 192. So this established the Pollution Adjudication Board. Then for the management of the use of natural resources, for land-based natural resource management, for forestry, we have PD 705, the Revised Forestry Code of the Philippines. For the mineral resources, we have RA 7942, the Philippine Mining Act. For agriculture, we have RA 8435, the Agriculture and Fisheries Modernization Act or AFMA. We have RA 6657, we have the Comprehensive Agrarian Reform Law. For water resource management, for the water itself, we have PD 1067, the Water Code of the Philippines. For fisheries, we have RA 8550, the Philippine Fisheries Code. For the energy resources management, for energy, we have RA 7638, the Department of Energy Act of 1992. For biodiversity and ecosystem management, for protected areas, we have RA 7586, the National Integrated Protected Area System or NIPAS Act. This is supplemented with RA 11083 in 2018, that is the extended NIPAS Act. For wildlife protection, we have RA 9147, the Wildlife Resources Conservation and Protection Act. For caves and cave resources, RA 9072, the National Caves and Caves Resources Management and Protection Act. For climate change and disaster risk management, for climate change, RA 9729, the Climate Change Act. For disaster, we have RA 10121, the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Act. For socio-cultural resources management, we have for the indigenous people, we have RA 8371. This is the Indigenous Peoples' Right Act or IPRA. We have the cultural resources, RA 10066, Natural Cultural Heritage Act. So these are actually the environmental management laws in the Philippines. Now, as I've mentioned a while ago, that the country or these environmental management laws in the country are actually anchored in international commitments. So we have treaties, conventions that the Philippines ratified or participated on. So the following are the environmental treaty commitments. So we have the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That is UNFCCC. It is focused on, of course, the climate change. The Montreal Protocol, focused on the ozone-depleting substances. Convention on Biological Diversity, focused on the biodiversity. The United Nations Convention on Laws of the Sea. This is actually it focused on the territorial seas of each country. The Basel Convention on the Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Waste and their Disposal. This involves the movement of hazardous waste from one country to another country. For the international agreements, we have the following. The Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, the International Tropical Timber Agreement, the World Heritage Convention, the ASEAN Agreement on Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, the Vienna Convention on the Protection of the Ozone Layer, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development or the Global Agenda 21, the Kyoto Protocol for the greenhouse gases. This is succeeded actually by the Paris Agreement. We have the ASEAN Agreement on Transboundary Haze Pollution, the Rotterdam Convention, the Stockholm Convention on the POPs or persistent organic pollutants, the Cartagena Protocol that focus on biosafety, and the MARPOL Convention that is focused on the pollution of ships in due to occupational or accidental damage in the seas. So these are just some of the international agreements and treaties in which the country has participated. Now, in terms of enforcement and adjudication, of course, every law should be properly enforced. And now, if there are some violations, these violations should be adjudged properly. Now, in the Philippines, the Department of Environment and Natural Resource is the only agency that has the mandates over the different components of the environment, such as land, water, air, people, and culture. And at the same time, the various management areas identified. Now, under DNR, it is actually the EMB or the Environment Management Bureau under PD 1586 of the Philippine Environmental Impact Statement System to look into all of the identified environmental components as well as the management areas. However, there are also other agencies independent of DNR likewise have enforcement responsibilities in other areas of environmental management. Now, the country, in terms of adjudication, the country's adoption of the 2002 Johannesburg Principles on the role of law and sustainable development led to initiatives to strengthen the role of courts in settling environmental cases. The principles focus on tackling environmental challenges through improved legal systems. Among the principles agreed upon during the symposium is for the access to justice, for the settlement of environmental disputes, and the defense and enforcement of environmental rights. Now, many nations, including the Philippines, have come to realize the importance of these principles and have begun developing their own environmental courts and tribunals. Now, for the Philippines, we have the innovative rules of procedure for environmental cases. This actually makes the Philippines as the first nation with rules of procedure specific to environmental cases. So these rules were promulgated to enforce the constitutional right to a balanced and helpful ecology as provided for the Philippine Constitution. The main objectives of the rules are the following. So to provide a simplified, speedy, and expensive procedure for enforcement, environmental rights and duties recognized under the Constitution, existing laws, rules, and regulations. To introduce and adopt innovative and best practices, ensuring the effective enforcement of remedies and redress for violation of environmental laws. And lastly, to enable the urge to monitor and exact compliance with orders and judgment environmental cases. Now, these rules include provisions for the following: citizen suits, consent decrees, environmental protection orders, writ of kalikasan, writ of continuing mandamus, the strategic lawsuits against public participation, and the precautionary principle. But I would like to focus on the writ of kalikasan. So the writ of kalikasan, it is written this way: the writ is a remedy available to a natural or juridical person, entity authorized by law, people's organization, non-governmental organization, or any public interest group accredited by or registered with any government agency on healthful ecology violated or threatened with violation by an unlawful act or omission of a public official or employee or private individual or entity involving environmental damage of such magnitude as to prejudice life, health, or property of inhabitants in two or more cities of provinces. The writ of kalikasan is actually a remedy, a legal remedy that lay down the protection of one's to to a to a to a healthful environment. So this writ of kalikasan is immediate in nature, and the rules provide specific remedies which include directing respondent to permanently cease and desist from committing acts of neglecting the performance of a duty in violation of environmental laws resulting in environmental disruption or damage, directing respondent public official, government agency, private person, or entity to protect, preserve, rehabilitate, or restore the environment, directing the respondent public official, government agency, private person, or entity to monitor strict compliance with decision and orders of the court, directing the respondent public official, government agency, private person, or entity to make periodic reports on the execution of the final judgment, such other reliefs which relate to the right of the people to a balanced and healthful ecology or to the protection, preservation, rehabilitation, or restoration of the environment except the award of damages to individual petitioners. So from this writ of Kalikasan, we could see that it is actually the responsibility of everyone to maintain a healthful ecology. So a balanced and healthful ecology. And it is actually the responsibility of everyone to protect, preserve, rehabilitate, and even restore our environment. So from this chapter, we have learned the following. So environmental regulation and governance in the Philippines, it started as early as 1866. The environmental governance in the Philippines is multi-sectoral and multi-level. The key governance strategies in the country are the following: decentralization, devolution, and co-management as part of participative governance. Laws are actually the key pillars of governance. So the basic policies for environmental management are provided in two presidential decrees. These are the Philippine Environmental Policy or PD 1151 and the Philippine Environment Code or PD 1152. These are both issued in June 6, 1977. We also talk about the different environmental laws, and they are categorized based on the major environmental management intent. So they are categorized according to environmental quality management, management of the use of natural resources, biodiversity and ecosystem management, climate change and disaster management, social cultural resources management. And law enforcement and education of environmental courses are important aspects of environmental governance and management. So that concludes our Module 3 or the overview of the environmental management in the Philippines.